11 days. At day 11, PET imaging studies show nicotinic acetylcholine receptor density approaching non-smoker levels. The extra receptors your brain built in response to years of overstimulation, the receptor upregulation that drove the intensity of early withdrawal, are being eliminated. The pharmacological infrastructure of your addiction is being dismantled. Simultaneously, the brain is actively pruning synaptic connections that reinforce smoking behavior. Long-term depression, the neurological process by which unused synapses are weakened and eventually eliminated, is operating on the old habit loops. The neural pathways that used to trigger automatic reaching for a cigarette are losing their strength through repeated non-activation. This is not psychology. This is structural neuroscience. Your brain is physically editing itself. At day 11, platelet aggregation has returned to non-smoker levels. The prothrombotic state induced by chronic nicotine exposure is clinically resolved. The Framingham risk score, the clinical tool used to estimate 10-year cardiovascular event probability, has already decreased. Each smoke-free day compounds the reduction. Hours 241 through 264. At hour 241, nicotinic acetylcholine receptor upregulation is measurably reversing. PET imaging in cessation studies documents that receptor density at this stage approaches non-smoker baseline. This is the pharmacological foundation of why day 11 feels different from day 3. On day 3, every unoccupied receptor was generating a demand signal. At day 11, there are far fewer receptors, and each surviving one is generating a weaker signal. The architecture of craving is deteriorating. At hour 242, the bronchial epithelial lining is actively regenerating. Pseudostratified columnar epithelium, the normal airway lining, is replacing damaged squamous metaplasia, the abnormal cellular change that chronic smoke exposure caused. The airway is rebuilding its proper structural identity. At hour 243, platelet adhesiveness and aggregation have returned to non-smoker levels. The prothrombotic state, induced by chronic smoking, which elevated clot formation risk throughout your vascular system, is clinically resolved. Your blood is flowing through your vessels with the same rheological properties as blood that has never been exposed to chronic nicotine. At hour 244, natural killer cell cytotoxic activity is approaching non-smoker baseline. These innate immune cells, which detect and destroy virally infected and precancerous cells, are regaining their surveillance capability. The immunosuppressive effect of chronic nicotine on NK cell function is largely resolved. At hour 245, cutaneous blood flow has normalized. Laser Doppler flowmetry would show restored dermal microcirculation. Oxygen and nutrient delivery to skin tissue is operating at normal levels. This is why skin appearance improves measurably by around day 10-11. It's not a superficial change, it's a consequence of restored vascular function. At hour 246, basal metabolic rate has stabilized at its true baseline. Nicotine's artificial thermogenic elevation is fully cleared. Caloric expenditure now reflects actual resting metabolism. Appetite regulation is normalizing as leptin and ghrelin signaling rebalances. At hour 247, working memory capacity has returned to pre-addiction baseline. Prefrontal cortex function, which was paradoxically impaired during acute withdrawal, is now operating at the same level as it would in a non-smoker with the same demographic profile. You have your full cognitive tools available. At hour 248, periodontal blood flow has normalized, allowing gingival tissue to heal at the deeper structural level. Pocket depth measurements would show early improvement as chronic inflammation subsides from the connective tissue around tooth roots. At hour 249, VO2 max is measurably improving. Carbon monoxide's displacement of hemoglobin's oxygen-carrying capacity is fully resolved, which was the immediate gain. Now the chronic structural gains in pulmonary gas exchange efficiency are compounding. Maximum oxygen uptake during exercise is higher than it's been. At hour 250, the Framingham risk score has already decreased. Each smoke-free day reduces the 10-year probability of a major cardiovascular event. These are actuarial numbers. They're calculated from the same data that drives life insurance tables and clinical treatment guidelines. Every hour of cessation is bending the curve. At hour 251, the brain is actively pruning synaptic connections that reinforced smoking behavior. The term for this process is long-term depression, a specific form of synaptic plasticity where unused connections lose their strength. Every time a cue arose this week and you didn't smoke in response to it, you allowed that cue-response synaptic connection to weaken by non-activation. Repeated non-activation leads to structural synaptic change. The synapse physically retracts. The old habit loop loses its hardware. At hour 252, cilia throughout the tracheobronchial tree have regrown to approximately 70% of non-smoker density. The mucociliary escalator is functional throughout your airways. The physical sensation of breathing is easier. And this is measurable, not subjective. If you've been physically active this week, you've felt it. At hour 253, arterial compliance, measured by pulse wave velocity, is continuing to decrease. The endothelial nitric oxide pathway is functioning more efficiently. Arteries are more pliable. The heart is working against less resistance. At hour 254, CD4 plus and CD8 plus T lymphocyte ratios are normalizing. The immunosuppressive effects of chronic nicotine on adaptive immunity are largely resolved. Immune coordination is restored. The helper and cytotoxic arms of the T-cell response are working in their proper proportion. At hour 255, fibroblast activity in the dermis is normalizing. Collagen types I and III synthesis is increasing. The structural protein framework of your skin is being rebuilt. This is a slow process. Collagen remodeling takes months. But day 11 marks the point where the synthesis rate has returned to normal and the net balance has shifted from degradation to construction. At hour 256, peripheral insulin sensitivity is increasing as nicotine's interference with insulin receptor signaling is fully resolved. Glucose uptake by skeletal muscle is normalizing. The metabolic dysregulation of chronic nicotine exposure is cleared. At hour 257, the dorsal attention network, which was hijacked by nicotine-dependent activation patterns, is functioning normally. Conversations hold your attention. Tasks don't require the constant re-engagement that characterized early withdrawal. The ability to sustain focus without nicotine's assistance is restored. At hour 258, oral pH has returned to normal range. The acidic shift caused by tobacco smoke had compromised enamel and mucosal tissue. Normalized pH supports remineralization and mucosal integrity. At hours 259 and 260, mitochondrial biogenesis in skeletal muscle is normalizing. Aerobic enzyme activity is increasing, and your cumulative stroke risk has already decreased measurably. The combination of improved blood flow, reduced platelet aggregation, and declining fibrinogen levels is compounding in cardiovascular protection. At hour 261, GABAergic inhibitory tone has normalized. The anxiolytic effect that nicotine artificially provided by modulating GABA receptors has been replaced by the brain's own properly functioning inhibitory system. Anxiety levels have settled to their natural baseline. The chronic edge of nicotine-dependent calm, which was masking the anxiety nicotine itself was causing, is gone. What remains is actual calm. At hours 262 and 263, small airway resistance is improving further. Fibrinogen concentration is decreasing toward non-smoker levels, and the day ends with measurably improving cardiovascular and respiratory function across multiple dimensions. At hour 248, the clinical timeline records something specific. The identity shift from smoker trying to quit to non-smoker is beginning to take root. This framing has clinical meaning beyond psychology. Cessation research consistently finds that self-identification as a non-smoker, rather than as a former smoker or someone in recovery, predicts long-term abstinence outcomes. The distinction is not about denial or suppression, it's about the integration of the physical reality. At day 11, the physical reality supports the identity. Nicotinic receptor density is approaching non-smoker baseline. Platelet aggregation is at non-smoker level. Airway inflammation has substantially resolved. Dopamine baseline is recalibrated. Sleep architecture is normalized. Working memory is restored. The biological state of your body at day 11 is closer to a non-smoker's than to an active smoker's across every measured parameter. The identity isn't claimed in defiance of the biology. It's licensed by it. Habitual triggers still register. They still create a momentary activation. but they feel, as the clinical language puts it, like memories of a former routine rather than urgent commands. The signal is there, but the weight has left it. Every day this continues, the signal weakens further. Hour 264. 11 full days smoke-free. Nicotinic receptor downregulation is well advanced, approaching non-smoker levels. Platelet aggregation is clinically normalized. The Framingham cardiovascular risk score has decreased. Synaptic pruning of smoking-associated circuits is underway. Sleep architecture is restored. Working memory is at pre-addiction baseline. And from the clinical timeline, completing day 11 brings a sense of accumulated momentum. Each hour is investment that cannot be lost. Infrastructure for the days ahead. 3 days remain in the 14-day sprint. Day 12 is dopamine rebalancing completion. Natural rewards return to full salience. Coronary vasomotor tone improves. Hippocampal neurogenesis is active.